So basically, my new thing is just reminding people of the Middle Ages was a Christian period, and that there was a sort of a narrative and a ritual context for all of that, and that should actually affect the way we read these stories.
Exactly. And I think that what we want to do now is part of helping people understand, one of the things the Middle Ages act as a kind of mythological substructure to the modern world, whether people want to or not. Even though people are trying to kind of move away from it, so much of our dark, like even the idea that it's kind of went into the dark place where we have these dark stories and these fairy tales and these strange, misunderstood stories. Because the fairy tale, even if it's not medieval, it's medieval in its structure and it's medieval in its illusions, let's say. And
Right.
so all of that shows us that the Middle Ages are acting as this kind of, just like for the Greeks of the times of Athens, the Trojan War and the Odyssey were like this mythological backdrop to who they were. The Middle Ages are the mythological backdrop to who we are. And so we need to diving back into it and having a clear vision of what it can tell us and how it can more consciously structure our reality can be one of the solutions to the disenchantment that we're facing.
It's funny because somebody asked a question, and this might have been on an episode. I think this is on an episode of the Emmons Fool podcast. Somebody wrote in with a question of basically like, well, why is all fantasy or like the vast majority of fantasy, why is it set in a medieval setting? And it's for exactly the reason you just described. And this is what I was trying to explain. It's that's where we look back to, right? That's where our meaning comes from. Even that's where our monsters come from, that we're dealing with right now. Like it's all sort of contained in there, because there's this big medieval synthesis where basically it's the only time in human history when we've really had everything sort of come together and mesh together and fit together.
That's
And that
amazing because you say that, and so many people who are listening will think, what? The Dark Ages had a synthesis where everything came together? And it just shows how ignorant we are of what the Middle Ages had.
Well, and that's really, we're going to be talking about universal history today. That's really what universal history is about. It's about showing how the Christianity of the Middle Ages. Chesterton, in his poem "The Battle of the White Horse," he said, "It's only Christian men who was it? It's only Christian men who protect even pagan things."
Mm.
In other words, only Christianity, has the, let's say, the Catholicity, the universality, right, to actually take in the entire pagan world and integrate it, find a place for everything. And that's what you see basically happening in universal history. It's a way of fitting our story, right, the story of my people, whoever my people are, into kind of a master story, a master narrative.
Yeah. And this is something which was already there, let's say, before Christianity. That is, we have to understand that the ancient pagans had an intuition about other peoples, which is that when they would encounter other peoples, they would always be trying to pinpoint, for example, like, okay, so they have these strange gods. Let's recognize the strange gods, right? So, okay, so when they talk about this god, they're referring to Zeus, or they're referring to Ares, or they're referring to the same gods we have. They just had different names, and some of them, and it wasn't like a perfect system. Sometimes it was like, well, their god seems to be like a joining of these two gods that we're worshiping, let's say. But there was a sense in which it's not like this strange modern idea that somehow things are so arbitrary that they just pop up and you people can have all these traditions that are arbitrary, but rather that there is a common human experience, whether we're connected historically or just in terms of our nature, that will bring about similar stories, that will bring about similar principalities, that will notice different principalities in the world, and we end up worshiping the same gods. And so even it was there before Christianity, but then when Christianity arrived, there is almost this idea that all of this now culminates into Christ, and all the good elements of these ancient traditions can be kind of pulled into this one story.
Yeah. In The Discarded Image, Lewis says, I think it's in the preface or like the introduction to the book, he says that there was, of course, and he actually divides it into right and left. Obviously, you'll understand, and your listeners who've been paying attention for a long time will understand the symbolism of the left hand really is to sort of push something away, right? So he says there's a Christian left that was always trying to get rid of these things.
Yeah.
But then there was always a Christian right who would say, along with, St. Justin Martyr or Justin the Philosopher, whatever true things have been said by men at any time belong to us Christians. And of course, you could look at that now and say, oh, that's just appropriationism or something like that. And first of all, technically, yes, right? There is, this university in California that has this proposed, class that they want to start teaching that actually Christianity is guilty of what they call theocide, which again, yes, it's sort of our deal, right? but also, what people don't always understand there is that when these things die, that they have a capacity to be resurrected in a way that allows them to participate within the larger story of the Christian world. So you do see the seeds of this happening in, for instance, Herodotus, when he encounters Egyptian society, spends a whole lot of time trying to figure out how do the gods that the Egyptians worship map to the gods that we worship, right? But then what Christianity does is it integrates it in a more complete way, right? So that you don't have competing principalities, so that everything is able to kind of lay itself out in a hierarchy that lets you figure out where your story fits into this larger narrative.
Yeah, exactly. And the idea of that we're appropriating, it's so hilarious. It's as if it's like you think that that these were copyrights, or that the purpose of the world is to be original and to like come up with the new thing that hasn't been done before. Every time someone says that Christianity has elements of things that are there before them, I'm thinking, like, are you patenting these things? Like, what reality do you actually live in? Like, that's how it works. We take the things that are given to us, and then we try to fit them in a way that will be more real, and that will be more conducive to like a universal history, like the one that Christianity finally ended up coming towards. That this was actually a historical process that wasn't done by one person, that was kind of, we don't even know who was doing it sometimes. It just is this organic thing that happens and pops up in legends and pops up in different texts. But it's just a funny thing, like to think that somehow these stories, that somehow reality is so arbitrary that we could be like stealing ideas from other, like companies steal tech ideas from each other.
Yeah. One way to think about the development of narrative in the Middle Ages is that it's not until a very, very late stage, basically until Dante, right? Dante is kind of the first self-conscious author, right? In the sense that he's really the first person. Obviously, there are a lot of works which will begin with, pray for the poor wretched sinner whose name I'm not even going to give you because I'm so unworthy, because I'm going to now relate to you these great things, or something like that. But Dante's really the first sort of like, in one sense, kind of, he's standing right there on the cusp of the medieval and the modern, because he's the first person who sort of writes himself into the story. But before that, the writing in the Middle Ages is characterized by two things. One is a deep respect for authority. And authority really, at the end of the day, means anything else written down, right? Because writing is very expensive. People don't write stuff unless it's important. So a deep respect for the authority of the earlier text. And then also, secondly, basically no concept of the idea of authorship. Like our ideas today of authorship, plagiarism, things like this would not even make sense back then. That's why when people get a little hung up on things like, well, who's the real author of this pseudo-epigraphal text? Like only a modern person can ask that question and it be meaningful, right? So I wrote an article on the symbolism of Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, right? And his story basically just takes all of everything I'm saying right now and just kind of combined it, right? So there's this whole body of text, and the question is, most scholars today say it was actually authored by somebody that they're going to call pseudo Dionysius, So in other words, not Dionysius, but somebody else writing under his name, right? Well, that's essentially just a modern hang-up.
And also the idea, it's also because it's the idea that text exist in a vacuum,
Right.
because the person who wrote that, pseudo Dionysius, so whatever, who knows who wrote it, didn't write it out of his own mind. He didn't just
Right.
sit down and think up something new to write. He was writing it based on things that had been handed down to him. And even if we don't know exactly how these things were handed down, they reveal themselves as being as they're received by the church and integrated into the church as appropriately transmitting certain things which were
Right.
already there in the tradition.
Right.